Good evening, everyone. My name is Alexandra Letvin, and I'm the Assistant Curator of European and American Art at the Allen Memorial Art Museum. I'm delighted to welcome you to our Allen After Hours lecture, Monarchs, Missionaries, and Meddlers, the Art of Making Early Modern Ethiopia. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items. First, this event has live closed captioning. If you would like to turn it off, you can do so by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your screen. If you keep it on, we would simply note that there may be some transcription errors, particularly with non-English words. At any time during this evening's lecture, please feel free to submit questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. After the lecture, we'll address as many questions as possible. Please note that your questions will only be visible to the audience once they've been answered. And now I am very pleased to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Kristen Windmuller-Luna. Dr. Windmuller-Luna is the Curator of African Arts at the Cleveland Museum of Art. A first-generation college student, she graduated with a BA in the History of Art from Yale and then went on to Princeton, where she received that university's first ever MA and PhD in the Art and Architecture of Africa. And she wrote her dissertation on early modern Ethiopian art and architecture. Prior to joining the Cleveland Museum of Art in 2020, Dr. Windmuller-Luna held positions at a range of public and private institutions, including the Brooklyn Museum, the Princeton University Art Museum, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Her recent exhibitions include Threads Across Time, African Textiles 500 to 1993 in Stories from Storage at the Cleveland Museum of Art, and African Arts Global Conversations at the Brooklyn Museum. Her next exhibition considers links between Northern and Eastern African civilizations and the Byzantine Empire. Expansive and inclusive new ways of collaborating, collecting, and curating are central to her museum practice, as well as mentoring upcoming professionals. Her research on historic and contemporary African arts has been published and presented in African, American, and European outlets. And she was recently elected to the Board of the Arts Council of the African Studies Association. Please join me now in welcoming Dr. Windmuller-Luna.
Thanks, Alexandra, for that very kind introduction, to the Allen for inviting me, and to everyone who has turned out for tonight's talk. Before I begin, I wish to acknowledge the current state of affairs in Ethiopia and express my hopes for a safe and peaceful future. I also want to give a special note of thanks and appreciation to my friends and colleagues there. In 1632, a young Eastern African man arrived in Cairo after a harrowing journey along the Nile River Valley. His travels took him through the court of the Sultanate of Funj in present-day Sudan, where he turned down a royal marriage and enraged the ruler. Barely escaping, camels carried him and his companions across brutal desert sands filled with snakes. He even fought off lions and tigers on more than one occasion. Now in Ottoman Cairo, he knocked on the door of the consulate of the Republic of Venice, a powerful trading empire. About 16 years old, the unexpected caller had astounding news. His name was Sägga Krәstos, Grace of Christ, and he was the rightful holder of the throne of the Christian kingdom from which he traveled. This kingdom traced its roots to King Solomon of the Bible. This kingdom was Ethiopia. Thus began Sägga Krәstos' fantastic journey from Ethiopia through North Africa and the Holy Land, on to Italy and then to France, where he died outside of Paris at 22. During his 6 years abroad, he advocated for his place on the Ethiopian throne, aligning with the Catholic Church. Receiving financial support from European leaders, he socialized among the elites and even got himself enmeshed in romantic scandals with both a married woman and a nun. All the while, he played the European leaders and religious men in his sphere against one another, exploiting their desire to spread Catholicism to help achieve his own goals. Along the way, the trailblazing artist Giovanna Garzoni, a rare female artist in a male-dominated era, painted this exceptional miniature of him, now at Oberlin's Allen Memorial Art Museum. This sensitive and skillfully rendered portrait, the first known portrait miniature of an African, is full of detail that belies its small scale. It's just a little larger than 2 inches. For perspective, I show it here against a hypothetical 6-foot-tall man. Using tiny dots of watercolor paint, Garzoni relied on the eye's ability to mix colors. To achieve this level of detail, she likely used a magnifying glass to paint it and expected viewers to do the same. Its handsome young sitter's face is unlined, with just a wispy mustache by way of facial hair. His warm brown eyes engage the viewer, left eyebrow arching slightly. He wears his hair natural, framing his head in a soft afro style that echo the longer hairstyles in fashion in Europe. Rather than Ethiopian royal clothing, he wears garments given to him when he first arrived at the court of the Spanish kingdom in Italy. Such was the custom at the time for welcoming visiting elites. Like Giovanna Garzoni, the Italian woman who painted his portrait, Sägga Krәstos was a savvy self-promoter who reached out widely and persistently to build his status and reach ever larger heights. This portrait may have been painted to send to a French court. Yet, Sägga Krәstos was not an Ethiopian prince. The story he told at ports of call in foreign courts, and which he had printed to share broadly, was false. The dates are wrong, some names fabricated, the plot scrambled. Even his heroic stories of fighting off wild beasts were fantastical. After all, there have never been wild tigers in Africa. Sägga Krәstos stretched the truth and often revised history to suit his needs. Yet, there is more than a kernel of truth to his story, because the Christian kingdom of Ethiopia was very real. It is one of the world's oldest Christian civilizations, with millennia of rich culture and history. Sägga used both his own knowledge of this kingdom and exploited European political and religious interest in it to promote his own agenda. In the first section of my talk, I will use the biography of Sägga Krәstos to take us through a brief tour of Christian Ethiopian art and architecture, all the way from the age of the Aksumite kingdom through the 1600s, when Sägga lived. In the second parts, we'll make stops at Lake Haik in Ethiopia, Cairo in Egypt, Rome and Turin in Italy, finally ending in Paris. At each of these stops, we'll check in on Sägga Krәstos' journey and explore the artistic relationship that Ethiopia had with these locations. In many ways, Sägga's multicultural journey exemplifies the extensive global connections of the Christian Ethiopian Empire, each of which contributed in some way to its visual culture. During the late medieval era and the early modern era, roughly 1500 to 1800, the Christian Ethiopian kingdom's diplomatic, political, and cultural relationships placed it squarely within the world of global Christendom. Contrary to misconceptions, Christian Ethiopian art was not derivative of foreign sources, but rather drew selectively from them. Its artists adapted, adopted, and remixed new influences according to their own political, cultural, and aesthetic norms. Equally, its artists purposefully used historical motifs in a kind of late antique Renaissance for political and religious reasons. First off, let's start with some background. Sägga Krәstos was from the Ethiopian Christian Kingdom, a territory that spanned present-day Eritrea and Ethiopia. This kingdom started in 1270 and lasted until 1974, when a communist coup overthrew the monarchy. Before that, the Aksumite kingdom existed in the region from the 1st through about the 10th century. That powerful empire's borders extended beyond Africa and into southern Arabia. A 1st century Greek author declared Aksum was one of the world's 4 great powers, along with Persia, China, and Rome. Its royals built tremendous palaces and monumental grave markers, like those at Rite. Most important to today's story, Aksum's ruler King Ezana became Christian around 330 AD. This makes Aksum the 2nd oldest Christian civilization, after only Armenia. The transition is clear in the kingdom's coins, where the crescent moon above the left ruler was replaced by a cross in Emperor Ezana's coin at right. By the time Sägga Krәstos was born, Ethiopia had been Christian for over 1,300 years. While it shares many texts, saints, and beliefs with other global Christianities, Ethiopian Orthodoxy has unique elements, including original text and art forms. Like other Christian cultures, it draws from a variety of global sources. So now that we've covered Christian Ethiopia's origins, we'll return to the 1600s and to Sägga Krәstos. Beyond his charm and reported good looks, why would European courts have been so eager to host this young Ethiopian? For centuries, Europeans believed in a rich and powerful Eastern Christian king called Prester John. They hoped he would be an anti-Muslim ally during the Crusades. As Ethiopian diplomatic and cultural outreach to Europe increased, Europeans came to believe Prester John led Ethiopia. Between 1400 and 1543, there were some 37 Ethio-European diplomatic connections, including 19 Ethiopian embassies to Europe. As Ethiopia discovered Europe, the mythical figure of Prester John became more grounded in reality, though it didn't disappear. Sägga Krәstos surely played up European interest in maintaining Christian power by allying with the so-called Prester John of Ethiopia. Sägga also exploited the related turmoil of the Christian Ethiopian kingdom. When Sägga Krәstos left Ethiopia in 1632, his homeland was enmeshed in a religious civil war put into motion by a Catholic mission. While Ethiopians were Christian, they didn't share the Catholic belief that Christ had a dual nature, both human and divine. They were Miaphysite, believing in Christ's single nature. In the 1550s, the Jesuits launched a mission to Ethiopia to convert it to Catholicism. After fits and starts, it had brief success. Emperor Susenyos chose to become Catholic in 1626, overturning centuries of Ethiopian orthodoxy. In this later French depiction, he greets Alfonso Mendes, Catholic Patriarch of Ethiopia. They stand in front of royal tents. Through the early modern era, the Ethiopian court was a traveling complex. Strictly organized, royal enclosures included tents for royals, churches, and tradespeople. Some were made of sumptuous imported silks. The emperor also had stone palaces, including one whose construction started the year of his conversion. One of Susenyos's 4 palaces, Dankas, is part of a lineage of Ethiopian royal palaces, stretching from the Aksumite Empire through the mid-20th century. Now in ruins, the palace boasted many floors and rooms, a deep underground cistern, steam baths, and elaborate furnishings. These included a Chinese bed and linens, imported rugs, and a portrait of the ruler. Painted plasters on its walls had interlacing designs that mimicked Iberian Muslim motifs drawn from North African sources. Susenyos's chronicle, a written account in Ge'ez of his life and reign, tells of the palace of Dankas and its makers. This excerpt is the song performed when the castle's construction was complete, celebrating the many men and women who contributed to the palace's creation, as well as hailing its patron, of course. Chief among these were the Ethiopian Sägga Krәstos, manager of the project and workers, the Indian Abdel Karim, stone-cutting master and lime mixer, and the Egyptian Sadaka Nezrani, master of the woodworkers. At the same time as Susenyos was building and outfitting his castle, the Jesuits were introducing Catholic art into the kingdom. For the Jesuits, art was a tool of conversion. Images of Mary appealed to Orthodox Ethiopians who were already devoted to Mary. Printed reproductions of the Virgin of Santa Maria Maggiore, a miraculous 6th or 7th century panel painting attributed to St. Luke, were among the most widely distributed images. Housed in Rome's Santa Maria Maggiore Church, it's the image at left. It's a Cretan Byzantine icon from about the year 500. Ethiopia was well placed to receive this particular image because it had previously absorbed Cretan icons into local veneration. Despite its mass circulation, only one known print of the Virgin of Santa Maria Maggiore remains, sewn into an Orthodox manuscript. It's the image at right. The 17th century European engraving shows the veiled Virgin holding a blonde, curly-haired Christ on her left side. He holds a book and gestures towards his mother. While Ethiopian artists had created images of the Virgin Mary since at least the 13th century, they enthusiastically adopted and adapted the Virgin of Santa Maria Maggiore. From the 1600s, Ethiopian artists changed her clothes, hair, skin color, and jewelry to be Ethiopian. You can see that here. Following a long-standing Ethiopian composition, the Santa Maria Maggiore Virgin now sits on a throne flanked by sword-bearing archangels. In an innovation of 18th century Ethiopian art, 2 donor figures lay at her feet, The patterned fabrics reflect the court's taste for imported Indian textiles. In other remarkable illuminations in this manuscript, such as that at right, the infant Christ and Virgin of the print stand up and move about. At right, Mary carries Christ with her wrapper in the Ethiopian manner, while standing near Ethiopian castles. Most dramatically, Christ and his mother appear as Ethiopians with dark hair and warm brown skin. While Ethiopian artists responded enthusiastically to the imported Virgin of Santa Maria Maggiore, not all things European or imported in general were accepted. When they were edited to fit Ethiopian aesthetic, cultural, and religious norms. Biblical scenes, such as the one at left, contain too much nudity to catch on. Sculptures of the baby Jesus, which the Jesuits hoped would emphasize Christ's humanity, didn't either, both because they clashed with Ethiopian Orthodox belief in Christ's single nature, and because that faith forbade sculpture. For rather obvious reasons, images of Jesuit saints like Ignatius of Loyola had no lasting impact on Ethiopia after the Orthodox Restoration. While Sägga Krәstos claimed he was fleeing from the Emperor Susenyos after the ruler killed his father, there may have been other reasons he left Ethiopia. By 1632, the kingdom was embroiled in a brutal Catholic Orthodox civil war. Professing Catholicism later in life, he may have fled Ethiopia to save his life as a persecuted Catholic. He may also simply have had ambitions beyond his own homeland or wished to escape the war. While this cannot be known for sure, his departure began his act of self-fashioning as an heir to the Ethiopian throne. So who was Sägga Krәstos and where did he come from? Some answers come from his autobiography, which he disseminated as hand-copied manuscripts and printed editions. At right is an Italian manuscript version. By writing his own story and sharing it with influential Europeans, he made up for his lack of recommendation letters and tried to quiet rumors about his real identity by building his own mythical status. While comparison with the historical records show he stretched the truth in his autobiography, clues to his background do dwell within it. They suggest that he was highborn and may have led a monastic life, as was the destiny of many young elites. Given his knowledge of Christian Ethiopian imperial history and scripture, he was likely literate as well. But we can get closer than that. We can pinpoint where he likely went to school. In the French printed version of his book, the excerpt at right describes how Sägga Krәstos studied in a community of the St. Tekla Haymanot in a place called the Island or Lake of Merowe in the city of Aitch. It further states that that is where all the royals are educated. This text saying Aitch is actually a Frenchified corruption of Lake Hike, where we'll travel to next. Lake Hike is located around 170 miles north of Ethiopia's modern capital of Addis Ababa. On the Western Peninsula sits a monastery called Debre Haik Stephanos, or the Monastery of St. Stephen. This is in all likelihood where Sägga Krәstos studied. It was the training ground of St. Tekla Haymanot himself, considered one of the five lights, the major source of knowledge of Ethiopian orthodoxy. The monastery of Debre Haik Stephanos, where Sägga Krәstos most likely studied, dates to 1248. It would have been a wonderful place for the young man to study. A 20th century survey of its library shows it retains over 200 manuscripts dating from the 13th through 20th centuries. Ethiopia has a long-standing history of book culture, whether for Christian, Jewish, or Muslim uses. Texts come in a few formats. Scribes wrote in ink or painted with tempera on parchment, binding manuscripts between leather-covered wooden boards. As Greek was the language of the Coptic Egyptian church, the mother church to Ethiopia's, religious works were first translated from Greek into Ge'ez. Ethiopian Christian texts are written in the language Ge'ez using the Ethiopic script you see here. Each character is a consonant combined with a vowel. Ge'ez is an Afro-Asiatic Semitic language used in the Horn of Africa since at least the 5th century BC. Other Semitic languages include Hebrew and Arabic. Ge'ez was spoken until roughly the 10th century and remains the religious language of Ethiopian and Eritrean Orthodox Christians, as well as Ethiopian practitioners of Judaism, the Beta Israel. When Sägga Krәstos was alive, religious books and other texts like royal chronicles were written in Ge'ez. Some texts were written in Amharic, which was also a major spoken language. Among the Ge'ez language books that may have been available to Sägga during his studies at Sägga Krәstos was this illuminated gospel from the late 14th or 15th century. It was likely a lavish gift from an emperor to the monastery. As such, it's one of the most elaborate early illuminated Ethiopian texts to survive to this day. Many Ethiopian Christian churches and the objects and books they contain were destroyed during a jihad in the 1500s. This gospel is turned to a full-page illumination of the Annunciation of Mary, the moment when the angel Gabriel told her of the coming virgin birth of Jesus. As is common in Ethiopian manuscript illuminations and paintings, there is a caption in Ge'ez above the image. On the right-hand side, we see some of the text. Regular words are typically written in black, while red is reserved for holy words, phrases, and names. A harag, or vine-like border, decorates the top of the page. Here, we see an illumination of a tholos, a round tent-like structure that serves as symbolic entry to the gospel text. The tent-like tholos may also have held special significance in Ethiopian Christianity. This one appears to be covered with fabric, like the royal and church tents I discussed earlier. Seeing it in the illuminated book, an Ethiopian Christian would have seen their own place of worship in a biblical context. At left is a canon table, a kind of biblical index. The illuminator has added local birds to the page and decorated the structure in a way that mimics how some Ethiopian churches were painted inside at the time. The illuminations in this gospel both draw from and expand upon earlier Ethiopian and other precedents. While of significant age, the Gospels of Sägga Krәstos are by no means Ethiopia's oldest. The monastery of Enda Abagarima to the north holds the earliest complete four Gospels now extant. These two massive illuminated tomes with metalwork covers are dated to AD 390 to 570 and AD 550 to 660. Tradition has it they were written in a day by Saint Garima in the 16th century. The illustrations of Garima Book 2 have affinities with Coptic and Byzantine painting and may provide the only testimony of Coptic-style canon table decoration. In the Abagarima illumination at left, marble columns were painted, even though there wasn't colored marble in Ethiopia. This indicates an outside source image as the reference. In the later Haik manuscript at right, the church is swathed in patterned fabrics to suggest an Ethiopian tent church. The volume also contains fine evangelist portraits. Moving left to right, we see how Ethiopian artists localized imported imagery of St. Luke, progressively adding dark, naturally styled hair and local style clothes and writing implements. Returning to Sägga Krәstos, Sägga Krәstos' likely school, there are more treasures of Ethiopian art. This is a very special painting of the Virgin Mary and the Christ child, called Semait, or the one who listens. It's likely the most important 15th century Ethiopian Christian icon to survive. Believed to be miraculous, it is still actively venerated. Christian painting in Ethiopia appears to have started sometime after Emperor Ezana converted, around 330 AD. Manuscript miniatures on parchment began around the 6th century, while the earliest surviving monumental wall paintings come from the 12th or 13th centuries. Icon paintings were popularized in the 15th century. Workshops of painters and scriptoria of scribes and illuminators were established at well-funded monasteries and royal courts. What we see here is a triptych, an icon with 3 panels. To start, the artist primed the wood with gesso, then made an underdrawing to plan the composition. Then he painted it with egg tempera paint. Though women could become nuns or commission a work of art, only men painted. Though some women now make church paintings, a female Ethiopian church painter would have been very unusual in the 1600s, even more so than the female painter Giovanna Garzoni in Italy's male-dominated art world. At center, a crowned Virgin Mary wearing a red dress and blue shawl holds the Christ child in her right arm. While her crown is adapted from Western Gothic and Renaissance art, Christ's hair is dark and curly, like an Ethiopian boy's. Marian devotion existed in Ethiopia from the 4th century, though the earliest remaining visual evidence of her worship is from the 13th. Marian imagery flourished after Emperor Zara Yaakov wrote the Meshufa Berhan, the Book of Light, in 1449, prescribing the role of painted Marian imagery in the Sunday liturgy. The text prompted a demand for portable icons like this. As in all Ethiopian icons, its figures are identified by captions in Ge'ez, the same language used in manuscripts. Unfortunately, this image file is a bit too small, otherwise I would read the captions off for you. Ethiopian Christian painting is hierarchical. The most important figures are largest. Mary and Christ, the most important here, are therefore the largest, while the sword-bearing archangels Michael and Gabriel are smaller. The side panels each have 3 rows of male figures. The upper row contains a variety of men with bare heads, headcloths, or turbans. All have golden halos. Some carry hand crosses, others open books, while one even rests hands atop a prayer cane. They look inwards towards Mary and Christ. Their iconography suggests they are priests or monks. And of course, reading the captions would confirm this. Also turned inwards at the bottom row on each side panel are 2 saints on horseback, each carrying a spear. Equestrian saints like these have appeared early on in Ethiopian paintings and have equivalents in Coptic Egyptian and other Orthodox traditions. Here, the saints have bare feet and hold the reins in their left hands in the Ethiopian riding style. Crosses project from the bottom of their spears. In 2006, the charity Ethiopian Heritage Fund restored the Semite icon, removing darkened varnish and centuries of accumulations that had obscured the image. Here, priests of the monastery hold it open. In the Ethiopian context, icons are not to be passively admired or looked at, but are actively used in worship. They are kissed or anointed with perfume and veiled with fine cloths. Some are displayed publicly only on certain feast days, where priests carry them aloft for all to see. Wealthy patrons commission large images like this one to gift to favored churches, and also commission artists to make them smaller icons for personal devotion. If he did indeed study at Debre Stephanos, Sägga Krәstos would have been surrounded by many important manuscripts and icons. Yet, in 1631 or so, he departed. Whatever his true reason was for leaving Ethiopia, Sägga Krәstos embarked upon a difficult journey along the Nile River Valley. Eventually, he reached Egypt, which was then a primarily Islamic land. In Jirga, the patriarch of the Coptic Church received him warmly, inviting him into the church. What Sägga saw in the church there may have looked familiar. The link between Ethiopia and Egypt's churches runs deep. Until the 1950s, the Ethiopian Orthodox and Coptic Egyptian Church were in union, and the Coptic Church chose Ethiopia's patriarch, their leader. Religious men, texts, and arts flowed between the two. This metallic glazed plate depicts a Coptic priest swinging an incense burner and standing alongside a large loop-topped cross. The scene is not too different from the descriptions of Ethiopian priests on the painted icon I just discussed. Indeed, the painting Sägga Krәstos encountered on a Coptic church's walls would likely have made him feel at home. At left is a Coptic painting of Saints Cosmas and Damian, while at right, an Ethiopian painting of the Saints Ewastaros and Tekla Haimanot from the walls of the Abba Antonius Church in Gondar. Compare briefly the frontal pose of the men, the strong use of lines, the simple halos, and the use of text captions. More so, Abba Antonius was a Christian monk from Egypt who became a saint and is regarded as the father of monasticism. Monasticism later spread to Ethiopia, forming communities like that of Tekla Haimanot, where Sägga Krәstos likely studied. While in Cairo, Sägga Krәstos impressed the chaplain of the Venetian consulate, Paolo da Lodi. He was the prefect of the Egyptian Franciscan monastery. As many Europeans would do, he glossed over the holes in Sägga Krәstos' story because he thought the young man could help him spread Catholicism. Whether Sägga Krәstos was a refugee, a persecuted heir, or simply an ambitious imposter, to many Europeans, he was Ethiopia's potential Catholic savior. Sägga Krәstos may have exploited their desire to spread Catholicism, and indeed the old myths of Prester John, to build his own high-status life in Europe. His acceptance by Paolo da Lodi in Cairo, and later in Catholic Italy and France, was strengthened when Sägga took the next step on his trip, a journey to Jerusalem and conversion to Catholicism. Sägga Krәstos' arrival in Jerusalem was part of a long Ethiopian connection to this holy city. His autobiography notes of his intense desire to visit and worship at the city's holy sites. There, he may have visited with the Ethiopian community at the monastery of Dar el-Sultan. Jerusalem has long been a focal point of Ethiopian Christian, and it was in 380 AD, only 50 years after Ethiopia adopted Christianity, that we have the first written reports of Ethiopian pilgrims in that holy city. There, they established a monastery and chapels, a present that endures today. Marked in green on the map, the round structure called Dar el-Sultan is on the roof of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Like most Ethiopian churches and monasteries, Dar el-Sultan had an impressive library. This particular volume of the Biblical Book of Kings is remarkable because it was among the first manuscripts that an Ethiopian emperor gifted Dar el-Sultan. It has a dedicatory passage from Emperor Amda-Sion, who reigned in the early 1300s. Establishing the relationship between Ethiopia and Jerusalem, the first book of Kings tells the story of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. In it, we learn how the Queen of Sheba, a ruler often linked to Ethiopia, visited Solomon in Jerusalem. Captivated by his religious knowledge, she began a relationship with him before returning home pregnant. A related story is told in the Kabra Nagast, the Glory of the Kings, which is Ethiopia's national epic, and Wright is a manuscript copy. Shades of the biblical story of Sheba and Solomon are evident in this text, which relates how the children born of their liaison, Menelik, brought the Ark of the Covenant from Jerusalem to Ethiopia, where it still resides. According to the Kabra Nagast, Ethiopia became the successor to Israel, and young Menelik became the first emperor of Christian Ethiopia's Solomonic dynasty. This dynasty of divine rulers linked to Solomon and thus to Jerusalem ruled Ethiopia almost uninterrupted until the 1970s. Jerusalem was so important to the Ethiopian Christian kingdom that when the kingdom of Jerusalem fell in 1187, the Ethiopians built a new Jerusalem from rock. Carved in two groups, the churches of Lalibela stand on either side of the River Jordan. Other place names include the Church of Golgotha, where Christ was crucified, and the Church of Mount Sinai. This firmly put the stories and places of the Bible in Africa. Among the most iconic of Lalibela's churches is the cross-shaped Church of St. George. Its architectural decor draws from the Aksumite kingdom, using the era's distinctive window and door frames with corner projections. These visual links to the foundation of Ethiopian Christianity link the rulers who commissioned these structures to the Aksumite past and legitimated their rule. According to King Lalibela's biography, angels helped him to carve the churches from the living rock. Architectural and historical analysis shows it was carved between the 7th and 13th centuries and once had a civic function. Sägga Krәstos sailed from Haifa in 1632 in September on a Venetian ship. Newly converted to Catholicism, whether out of faith or because adding religious credentials helped his story, he was ready to charm a new audience, which he did to great success. Once in Rome, he was hosted by the Propaganda Fide, a Catholic organization who sought to use him to restore Catholicism to Ethiopia. When Sägga Krәstos arrived in Italy, he followed in the footsteps of countrymen who had been there for centuries. Since the mid-1400s, Rome's Ethiopian community occupied the monastery and church of Santo Stefano degli Abissini. It was an enclave of Orthodox faith and the center of early modern Africanist studies and Ethiopian typography. Its church still stands behind St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican. Connections with this community gave Jesuit founder Ignatius of Loyola insight into Ethiopian religion and culture that he used to guide his Catholic mission to Ethiopia. European commentators were especially struck by the hand crosses that Ethiopian religious men carried. Christian monks made crosses in brass, silver, gold, and bronze, using the lost wax casting technique. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church links the cross both to Christ's crucifixion and to the tree of life mentioned in the book of Genesis. This interpretation is reflected in the foliate and natural forms present in many crosses. As this slide shows, like the hand crosses, there are many forms of Ethiopian crosses, from the personal like pendants to the public like the hand crosses carried by priests for benediction, to the liturgical, the processional cross. In Rome, their Italian Catholic counterparts would have seen many similarities between Ethiopian crosses and their own. One Ethiopian priest left an especially big legacy in Italy. Working in Rome, the Ethiopian printer priest Tesfatsion printed the Novum Testamentum, the first Ge'ez Bible in print. At right is his memorial stone at Santo Stefano, inscribed in Latin and in Ge'ez. Sägga Krәstos had his own literary moment while in Rome. He wrote an autobiography, in part to quell investigations into his credentials that first started in Cairo. The first printed African autobiography, it was disseminated throughout the European courts. Just as Ethiopian Christians and their art and religion were present in Europe, Europeans and their art had been in Ethiopia long before Krәstos' journey. European paintings and art objects may have first entered the Ethiopian kingdom as part of a gift exchange with Emperor Dawit's 1402 embassy to the Republic of Venice. As early as the 15th century, European painters like the Venetian Niccolò Brancaleone worked for Ethiopian rulers. Known as Mercurius the Foreigner, one of his paintings is seen here alongside of that of his likely Ethiopian student Afnin, who drew inspiration from Brancaleone's Italianate style while interpreting it with his own compositional flair. Foreigners were often employed not so much for their skill, but for the prestige that they impressed upon the court as exotic symbols of the ruler's status and worldly power. European artists introduced not only individual new works, but also new themes, such as the Nursing Virgin and St. George's Dragon, which Ethiopian artists again adapted, remixed, or even rejected as they saw fit. Venice, too, was a stop on Sägga's itinerary as he traveled through the Italian peninsula. Suffering from bouts of ill health, he frustrated his religious minders by turning down surer options to return to Ethiopia in favor of staying in Europe. Eventually, he came to Turin in northern Italy in 1634. While in Turin, Sägga Krәstos sat for the portrait that is at the center of my talk. The painter was Giovanna Garzoni, who, like Sägga Krәstos, traveled extensively and sought court patronage. Like the Ethiopian man she painted, she received the support of the Duke of Savoy, painting there from 1632 through 1637. Considered the greatest miniaturist of her era, she was one of its few female artists, a true polymath with talents in painting, calligraphy, and music. She was also known for her colorful, carefully observed still lifes, whose depictions of flora and fauna were both artistic and scientific. Here, fruit and birds are accurately detailed, yet they are rendered nearly equal in size in the theater of her canvas. And if you're interested in learning more about Giovanna Garzoni, I encourage you to look up the catalog of a recent exhibition of her at Florence's Uffizi Gallery. Now, let's look at the back of the miniature of Sägga Krәstos. There is a dual inscription written in both Ethiopic and Latin scripts. Using Italian and Latin languages, the bottom inscription reads, Giovanni Garzoni made this. At top, the same inscription is written phonetically, that's sounded out, in the Amharic language. You can imagine Sägga Krәstos showing her the characters, helping her match spoken Italian sounds with Amharic. As some scholars have suggested, Garzoni's choice to sign her piece in both an African and a European language indicates her connection with Sägga. The realistic, non-stereotyping way she depicted him also supports this idea. She painted him in a similar pose and outfit to the Duke of Savoy, his host in Turin, as well as appointed godfather when Sägga Krәstos took confirmation in that city in 1635. She used body color, a white pigment suspended in watercolor, to paint their intricate lace collars. These were made of needle lace, where the design is stitched together using needle and thread. The technique originated in 16th century Italy and is likely where Sägga Krәstos' collar came from. The European court clothes that Sägga wore were not elite fashion in Ethiopia, however. Ethiopian rulers such as Susenyos wore sumptuous garments and jewelry imported from China, India, Europe, Turkey, and beyond. In the illumination it left, Emperor Ieyasu and his mother, Empress Wolete Georgis, wear patterned robes, jewelry, and crowns. Their courtiers, including the reclining as well as the reclining elites in the wall painting at right, were fine but also less elaborate garments. Indeed, Sägga Krәstos' autobiography notes that he gave away many jewels while on his way to Cairo, suggesting he was at least familiar with how Ethiopian high status people were dressing. It was customary in the early modern era to give distinguished guests court clothing upon their arrival, suitable for formal events and festivities. In this era, class, position, and faith, rather than someone's skin color, mattered above all. We see similar court dressing in two images of Antonio Manuel Novunda, ambassador to the Vatican from the West African Kingdom of Congo. At left, in his tomb sculpture in Rome, he wears the netted garment of Congo elite. At right, in a print, he wears European-style court dress. In mid-1634, word reached Europe that Susenyos had died and his pro-Orthodox son had taken the throne and expelled the Jesuits. As a result, the European desire to support Sägga Krәstos increased, as did plans for him to return to Ethiopia to reclaim the throne and kingdom for Catholicism. With a generous amount of money from his godfather, the Duke of Savoy, Sägga Krәstos left for France in 1635. He soon received an enormous annual pension from the French ruler Louis XIII. It is then that he seems to have made up his mind to stay in Europe and to abandon the religious men whose ambitions to use him to spread Catholicism he had capitalized on. France, too, was not a new territory for an Ethiopian to visit or to have diplomatic ties with. Sometime before 1422, France's Duc de Berry had sent a diplomatic mission to Ethiopia. He may already have met Ethiopians when they came to France after being delegates to the Council of Constance in Germany. The Limburg brothers depicted those three men in an illuminated manuscript commissioned by Jean, Duc de Berry. Praying or standing around the altar, each carries a small iron cross, as was customary for Ethiopian religious men. Likewise, Ethiopian elites had patronized French artists long before Sägga Krәstos' arrival. They commissioned Limoges enamels with Ge'ez inscriptions, such as this triptych photographed at a Tigrayan church in the 1970s. The Ge'ez inscriptions are part of the enamel and not painted on later. Through works like this, Ethiopian artists were exposed to Western European biblical compositions and scenes. This French enamel itself was based upon a crucifixion scene by the German artist Albrecht Dürer, itself showing the role of artistic influence within Europe. Though Ethiopian artists hadn't previously depicted Christ on the cross to emphasize his triumph over death, they gradually chose to adapt imagery of Christ's suffering from European works like the Limoges triptych. Sägga Krәstos' story comes to an end in France. There, he died of illness at age 22 in April 1638 at Cardinal Richelieu's home in Ruel, outside of Paris. His high-flying, well-financed life in France came to an extremely dramatic end. Accused of adultery and attempted murder in a series of scandals involving a married woman and a nun, he had been jailed in Paris in November 1637. Reportedly, his last words to his jailers were that he was, quote, not born to obey, but rather to command. He was buried at the church in Ruel. Among his possessions at death were two religious manuscripts, now the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. One is a treatise on divinity meant to serve as a refuge for the weak. The other is the Argonon of Dengel, the Harp of the Virgin, a book of prayers to the Virgin Mary, divided into the days of the week. We can imagine him reading the prayers aloud or silently in his head, or even showing these manuscripts to others. Maybe these are how he taught Giovanna Garzoni the Ethiopic script that she used to sign the back of his portrait. In one of these books, he wrote an abbreviated version of his story, the text on screen now. It says, this of Sägga Krәstos, son of Prince Arza, the son of Adumas Sigurd. They expelled me from my country, and I came alone to Rome. While he noted his royal lineage, it's worth pointing out that he did not claim the throne. Traveling abroad with a limited group of people who could read Ethiopic script, one has to wonder, who did Sägga Krәstos write this for? Perhaps he wrote it for himself, a private moment of telling his story in his own words and own language. While the life Sägga Krәstos lived in European courts was glamorous, and he may have desired to stay there, This personal note of solitariness suggests how hard it may have been for him to leave Ethiopia and to live abroad. While his journey ended in 1638, an artistic renaissance flourished in the Ethiopia where he had hoped to claim the throne. Started during the reign of Susenyos, what art historians would come to call the Gondarine style of art and architecture took shape at the royal capital. Fasilidas, who returned Ethiopia to orthodoxy, built the first of many castles that would draw from Ethiopian, Portuguese, and Indian sources. While most things European and Catholic were destroyed after Fasilidas expelled the Jesuits, some books remained, bringing in new scenes of biblical stories. Just as they had done before with foreign artistic influences, Ethiopian artists adapted their illustrations to their own faith and artistic sense. Here's just a small sampling of the magnificent paintings of the era. The so-called Gondarine artistic renaissance would continue in earnest until the mid-1700s, influencing Ethiopian Christian art to the present day. Recounting the story of Sägga Krәstos, a young world traveler filled with ambition, is like telling the story of Christian Ethiopia's global connections in miniature. Like the rulers and artists of his homeland, he both drew from his heritage and chose to embrace elements of foreign culture. Through the small, vibrant portrait that Giovanni Garzoni painted of him, his story, his individuality lives on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Windmuller-Luna, for a really rich and fascinating talk. So I invite our audience members to submit any questions you have in the Q&A box. And while people are perhaps taking a minute to compose their questions, I thought I would just ask you, I understand that Ethiopia kind of features prominently in an exhibition that you're working on now. And I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit more about that.
Yes, thank you for asking. I am so honored to be working with the wonderful Dr. Andrea Aci at the Met to create an exhibition that will look at Northern and Eastern Africa's relationship with the Byzantine Empire. We're really focusing on the great kingdoms like Aksum and the later Christian Ethiopian Empire, the Christian empires of Nubia, of Northern Africa, and thinking about telling the story of the Byzantine Empire and of early global Christianity from about the year 300 to 1500 in a new and very exciting way. The exhibition will open in New York City in late 2023 and here in Cleveland in 2024. So please mark your calendars quite early in advance.
Well, that's very exciting. So we have something to look forward to.
Yes.
So I can turn now to some of our audience questions. We have a couple kind of very specific ones. Some that came in a little bit earlier in your talk. So one was, this is from Vivian Lewis. And the question is, does the loop-topped cross from the incense diffuser image hold any symbolic connection or similarity to an Egyptian Ankh?
Vivian, I love that you asked this and you are absolutely spot on. It's such a lovely example of how Christianity adapts to where it goes. And there certainly was a connection of the Ankh, the looped topped symbol of life from pharaonic Egypt, with the Christian cross in that Coptic imagery.
Thank you. So we also have a question from Charles Kang, and Charles asks, I have a question about the material aspects of the objects that you introduced to us. Do we know about what kind of pigments the artists, both local and European, used in Ethiopia? And then the same question about Garzoni's miniature. So the question is also about pigment trade, which was very globalized by the 17th century.
Thanks for the question so much, Charles. Most of the pigments in Ethiopian paintings were natural. Things like orpiment was one of the main colors for yellow ochre. There was not gold leafing present, very few examples of gold in manuscripts. Right now, the team at the Sägga in France, as well as the Walters Museum in Baltimore, are doing some really fantastic studies on the composition of Ethiopian paintings. And I'm very much looking forward to learning about their results and to learning more about the artistic process in that way.
Thank you. Daniel Wass asks, what is your thinking about why Emperor Susenyos embraced Catholicism? He put himself at considerable risk as a result of that.
Absolutely, Daniel. He did put himself at incredible risk. Susenyos' chronicle was written by his chroniclers and not by the emperor himself. So it's always hard to think about what someone's feeling internally. We can see quite strategically in the history of Ethiopia and global history, frankly, sometimes people choose to make alliances for strategic, political, and religious reasons, and even economic ones as well. It's quite possible that Susenyos might have seen this as a key to creating strong alliances with other global Christian kingdoms, or this may have been a matter of true faith and true belief for him. And again, absent writing in his own words, it's hard for us to know what was in his heart.
So I have sort of a related question from Richard Spear, who also thanks you for a very rich talk. And so he asks, what percentage of the Ethiopian population in the 17th century was Catholic? And then both Richard and Peter Kofsky are very curious about the language that Sägga Krәstos would have used when traveling outside of Ethiopia.
That's a really interesting question, Richard. And I can say that there were a lot of mass baptisms of people who became Catholic. And when Susenyos himself converted, the kingdom officially became Catholic as well. All that's to say, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church was fully running and functional at the same time. It's also possible people may have converted out of duress from local leadership. In terms of actual numbers, it's quite difficult for me to give you a sense of that. But I would say at least nominally everyone to a certain degree, but not fully.
Thank you. And then the question about the language.
Yes. So the language you spoke, I would actually defer to asking this to my colleague Matteo Salvador, who is working on extensive scholarship on Sägga Krәstos. The area of Northern Eastern Africa was extremely global, and people moved back and forth all the time. I think it's not impossible. Sägga may have known some Arabic. He may have known other languages as well. There were also many Ethiopians who lived in places like Egypt and Jerusalem, so he may have relied upon translators as well. And I'll hope Matteo can answer the question at some point.
Yeah, we can put in a plug for Matteo's many articles on this topic, and also that he is, as you said, preparing a book manuscript that will deal with the autobiography written. So we have a question from Lali Casa, which is, I think, great for our student audience in particular, which is, how did you become interested in early Ethiopian art? And have you traveled there for your research?
I really appreciate this question. I knew going into graduate school that I would be focusing on African art. And in my first semester of graduate school, I took a class on global art history with Professor Thomas da Costa Kaufman. And for my midterm paper, I worked on the churches of Lalibela, investigating claims as to whether or not there had been Egyptian contributions. During that time, I happened to read in the books that were available at the time, during the 16th and 17th century, nothing really important happened here, or, we'll brush that over. And one of Professor Kaufman's great sayings was, that's a dissertation topic. And he was absolutely right. And I was very delighted to be able to learn and to share my research about the Ethiopian aspects of this era in history when the country was briefly Catholic and the Jesuits were doing quite an amount of meddling. To your question as well, Lali, I have traveled to Ethiopia many times. I was last there in 2019, and I dearly look forward to going back. And now, thanks to some extra time during the pandemic, I can go show off my knowledge of Ge'ez, which I've been learning while in lockdown.
Well, thank you so much. Maybe we can leave our question and answers there. But thank you again for such a rich, really wonderful talk. I learned so much, and I'm sure that our audience did as well. So we really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you, everyone.